I'm really excited to be here tonight with Neil Miller and with all of you. Neil teaches journalism at Tufts University and is an award-winning author of 5 nonfiction books. 5, including the Stonewall Book Award-winning In Search of Gay America and the Arizona Book Award-winning Karshner Caverns. He's also, of course, the author of Banned in Boston, the Watch and Word Society's Crusade Against Books, Burlesque, and the Social Evil, which is our core topic tonight. So welcome, Neil.
Oh, thank you, Matt.
Let's just get into it.
Okay.
All right. So, Neil, what is the Watch and Word Committee?
The Watch and Word Society was originally established in 1878. It was called the New England Society for the Suppression of Vice. And it was originally an adjunct of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, which was founded by Anthony Comstock and Stock. And the Boston group, then it changed its name to the Watch and Ward about 10 or 12 years later, and also declared independence from New York.
As well we should.
Yeah, but they were a group of some of Boston's leading citizens, really. Lots of ministers, people like Phillips Brooks, who was the rector of Trinity Church, for one, the author of The Man Without a Country, whose name is Edward Everett Hale, who was a leading Unitarian minister in Boston. So they were sort of the progressives of the late 19th century, but they saw themselves as the moral guardians of Boston. So essentially, they were crusading against obscenity, gambling, all sorts of things that they considered, drugs at a later time, things that they considered dangerous to the population. And there was this real sense of noblesse oblige. You know, we're taking care, our allies in the progressive movement of that period, if you want to call them that, were the liberal reformers, were taking care of the poor, and we're going to take care of their moral health. So, and also prostitution, another of their major issues, called in those days the social evil. These days we sort of know them mostly as for banning books. But they were involved in all sorts of other things too, including raiding poker games and keeping the lottery out of Massachusetts for many years. So they had quite a wide range of activities.
You mentioned obscenity specifically.
Yeah.
And what in late 19th century Boston, what does obscenity look like?
It's essentially anything that has to do with sex, even if you, and in the mildest possible terms too. So there was, it was harmful to youth, was kind of one of the major aspects of it. There was a state law against obscenity. And even if a book was the most moral of books, if there was the slightest hint of sex or, you know, even a goddamn, they were on this and they were out to suppress it.
I'm glad we're able to say goddamn on the.
Oh gosh, I didn't know that.
Watch and Word will be on top of you. Yeah, and how did this kind of, you know, this society of well-to-do Bostonians evolve from, you know, a meeting at Park Street Church to being the de facto regulator of culture in Boston? Well,
that is a good question. They were a very powerful group of people, and they hired someone who was the secretary of the group, who sort of began to go after these things that were damaging to Massachusetts society. In fact, it wasn't just Boston. So they would hire agents who would do things like, well, entrap booksellers into selling them books like Boccaccio's Decameron or Rabelais. Later, it was D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's lover. So they sort of became almost like the moral police of Boston, raiding, gambling houses and houses of prostitution. And at that time, I mean, there was a lot of corruption in police forces and city governments in Eastern Massachusetts. And they were somewhat going around these established forces and going after what they thought was danger to the moral health of New England.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting point that you do talk a little bit about in the book, that there are police. It's not like police don't exist. So why is it the police aren't enforcing these laws, and how are the Watch and Ward Society members able to enforce the laws? Where's that power coming from?
Right, because they're an extra legal group.
Sure, like vigilantes, but
yeah, they're vigilantes. Very well heeled and well dressed, and all the socially prominent people in Boston belonged to the society. $5 was membership, which maybe was a hefty sum in those days. But what they would do is they could get a warrant from a judge that the police had to enforce. So they used their own spies, if you will. And then they'd go to a judge and say, well, we found that there's a poker game going on here, or there's gambling, or there's a house of prostitution here. And the police had, once they got this warrant from a judge, the police had to enforce it. Now, sometimes they didn't, but, and sometimes the Watch and Ward would use their own agents. As well in these situations. So it's kind of hard to figure out today what they were doing, but their power was immense. And, for example, the treasurer of the Watch and Ward was one of the Cabots. And he was actually the richest man in Boston, Godfrey Lowell Cabot. And he sort of bankrolled the Watch and Ward. And, it was just a lot of really powerful people. But the thing is, it was primarily the sort of Protestant, if you will, upper class who were really afraid that their city was being taken over by immigrant groups, by the Irish particularly. There was a lot of conflict in that sense. The Chinese, like at a certain point, opium was, and I didn't write that much about it in Boston, but it was something they Watch and Ward was, either raiding these places, the opium dens themselves, or, getting the police to do it. So there was a lot of, part of it was just kind of this feeling that we're losing control of our city to these immoral people, if you will.
That's bringing up the opium trade and the Chinese in Boston is actually a really interesting point. With opium coming into Boston, and with other drugs coming into Boston, and with crime being what it was at the time, was there actually cause for alarm, or was this just a straight overreaction?
Well, it depends how you look at it. I mean, I don't think there was an epidemic of drugs, as there was, more in our time, but they were just scared of it. I mean, there were like temperance societies did not include the Watch and Ward. They really didn't go after the sale of liquor, but there was just again, this straight-laced, moralistic view of what you should do and what you shouldn't. I mean, it's not that there was that much obscenity either, or too many, books filled with frankness about sex, at least not until the 1920s.
Now, Ms. Hayhurst chimed in here on our chat, mentioning that this sounds like the Puritan ethos kind of reborn. And I imagine you've probably heard that analogy before in relation to Watch and Ward. Do you think there's anything to that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely the Puritanism of Boston, and a lot of the old families were descendants of the Puritans. And then by the 1920s, the Catholic Church it became more and more powerful and was also extremely conservative. So you sort of had these two strands of both the Puritanism of the watch and ward and then the sort of Catholic moralists. So it was like a double whammy for the city of Boston.
And that's such an interesting marriage, because you mentioned that the Puritan descendants, the Brahmin, Lowells, and Cabots are really the thrust behind the initial watch and ward. But then the Catholic Church gets really involved, despite the fact that they're directly related to those Irish and Italian immigrants that a lot of the folks in watch and ward were scared of.
Right, but they didn't really work together, though. Sure. They were definitely, they weren't at cross purposes necessarily, but by the 1930s, it was the mayors of Boston and the Catholic Church that was really cracking down, for example, on theater in Boston. A play like Eugene O'Neill's Strange Interlude, banned in Boston, and it was forced to open in Quincy. That center of culture.
Sorry to anyone from Quincy.
I don't mean to insult anyone from Quincy. It's a fine town.
Lovely place.
But that was not the watch and ward's doing. That, although I think they get blamed for everything. Yeah. But that wasn't. And a play like Lillian Hellman's The Children's Hour was banned in Boston. Again, that was the city did it. So the point being that at different points, there were different censors, and it really wasn't clear who was banning what, too. That's more in the 20s and 30s. In the earlier period, it was the watch and ward that was kind of in charge.
So, and with theater, you mentioned a couple of pieces of theater that had been banned or pushed out of Boston at various times, and that was predominantly the city that you.
Right. The watch and ward did ban some plays that worked to ban a couple of plays that we've never heard of today. They've sort of vanished. Something called the Clemenceau Affair, because there's a scene where there's a woman who's, I don't know, I'm not sure if she couldn't be naked, but she's. She was showing too much. Let's put it that way. That was forced to open in Lynn. They kicked it out of Boston. But the watch and ward sort of got burned on that. I don't know. So they stayed away from theater censorship. But the theater was banned in Boston long before the watch and ward, from 1750 to 1800, I think. I'm not an expert on that period, but plays were not allowed. So, but although burlesque was something that watch and ward was really concerned about right to the 1930s, and so that was their idea of theater, apparently.
Yeah, and censorship. And I want to get into burlesque in a minute. Before we do so, and then Ms. Taylor, I'm going to get to your question as well. But Dale Cohen asked, did the watch and ward have a particular attitude towards opera?
Oh, not that I know of. Yeah, but that's a good question. I haven't really considered it, but I don't believe so.
Next book.
Yeah, next book. Yeah, maybe opera just didn't have it didn't have the things that bothered the watch and ward. I mean, watch and ward was bothered by any mention of sex and insults to religion. That was kind of their.
Now, the label banned in Boston becomes something of a marketing tool.
Ooh, yeah.
Which is really fascinating to me. And Nancy Taylor asks, was there an underground market for these banned books, and how did that work? You tell this really great tiny story in the book about people going on trains to New York. Can you just share that with everyone?
Well, there's a very funny story. Upton Sinclair, the great muckraker who wrote The Jungle and all that, he wrote a book called Oil. Which was about corruption in the California oil industry in the 1920s. And it was banned in Boston. And the watch and ward was part of that one, I believe. Upton Sinclair came to Boston, and he was trying to get his book banned. but he was trying to sell it to police officers. Nobody would buy it. I mean, they were sort of onto his behavior. And, he said, he had some famous quote about America is our sales territory and Boston is our advertising agency or something. So the book was banned. Mm-hmm. The sales went up, they tripled that summer, I guess nationwide. Mm-hmm. And there's a story, I'm not sure where it comes from, where Sinclair got off the train from Boston in New York City. He's in, I guess, Grand Central Station or Penn Station or something. And he sees this stack of his book, Oil. And he was talking to the kiosk manager, who says, oh yeah, these books are going like hotcakes. Everybody who's taking the train back to Boston buys one. So they definitely were able to get around. But the thing is, as far as Nancy's question, and it's a good one, because the Watch and Ward often operated very surreptitiously. And they had this little committee, and they would read a book. And this is in the early 1920s. They would read a book. They would decide, okay, it's obscene. They would send a postcard to every bookseller in Boston saying, this book is actionable. So that meant that it could not be sold. And the booksellers, which were sort of in league with the Watch and Ward at that point, it was called the Gentleman's Agreement, immediately removed the book. It was never advertised in any of the Boston papers. It was never reviewed by Boston critics. And so some people didn't even know that these books ever came out. So while banned in Boston after a while became like a sales tool for certain books, that there were even labels, I think, banned in Boston. In the early period, they really kind of prevented people from reading books that they considered objectionable.
And that's really interesting. You mentioned this idea of a gentleman's agreement and everybody sort of just agreeing to this enforcement. To the extent that you can speak to it, what did that look like? How did they pull that off? That feels almost conspiratorial.
It's totally conspiratorial, and it's the reason that H.L. Mencken came to Boston and created a huge brouhaha about this, which kind of led to the Watch and Ward, one of the factors leading to their demise, because he was so angry that a small group of people had this kind of power. And the reason the booksellers went along with it is because they didn't want a Watch and Ward agent to come in there and entrap one of their salespeople, and they'd have to pay fines and stuff. So they just kind of went along with it, and nobody really objected to it. This is a very reserved and very well-behaved city, at least among some.
Yeah, and you mentioned too that folks are concerned about being entrapped in bookstores. So incidentally, the way I found out about Watch and Ward was from an exhibit at Old South Meeting House, which is of course one of our sites, because across the street was the Old Corner Bookstore, and there were incidents involving the Watch and Ward and the Old Corner Bookstore a number of times. Can you just speak on that a little bit?
Right. Well, the man who owned the Old Corner Bookstore, his last name is Fuller, and his first name is just, I'm forgetting it. Richard? I think so. Yeah. Anyway, his bookstore had been the target of one of these entrapment things, and he was the head of the Boston Booksellers Association. So he was, just very protective of his bookstore. But you see, at a certain point, the gentleman's agreement broke down, and the district and the Watch and Ward started to lose some power. The district attorneys and police were banning books, and they weren't being nice to these bookstores at all. And so it just became much more public, and there were big trials. There was a trial of the publisher of An American Tragedy, the great Theodore Dreiser novel in Boston, which was a huge cause célèbre. Mencken was he wasn't put on trial, but he had to go before a judge who actually acquitted him when he sold a copy of his magazine to the head of the Watch and Ward. So I think I'm not answering your question.
You're doing great, and actually, you brought up Mencken a couple of times, who is a fascinating figure. And for those who don't know who H.L. Mencken was, could you just recap him and that great story you opened the book with?
Oh yeah, when he came to Boston.
Yeah. So who is he, and how'd that go about?
H.L. Mencken was a really well-known journalist and sort of iconoclast, and wrote a number of books and was a really colorful figure, smoking a cigar and railing against all sorts of things in America they hated, including censorship and Puritanism. And, he wrote about the Scopes trial, famous essay. And he was a major cultural figure at that time. I mean, he sort of towered over everybody, but he was a real iconoclast. And in his magazine, The American Mercury, was banned in Boston because of a story about a prostitute in a small Missouri town. And he was just so outraged that he sort of staged this event on the Boston Common, right in front of the Park Street Church, where the Watch and Ward had been founded, in which he sold a copy of his magazine to the head of the Watch and Ward. And there were thousands of people there. It was like the Watch and Ward generally was very operating behind closed doors, but this time they sort of fell for the bait, I guess. And it was just this huge thing. There were like people hanging out of windows and Harvard students hanging out of trees and all kinds of stuff. And as a result, Mencken was arrested, but a judge the next day acquitted him, said that the story was not obscene after all. He was arrested for selling obscene material. So after that, the Watch and Ward, it was a huge defeat because they had a record of winning 98% of all court cases, whether it be book censorship, gambling, prostitution, you name it. I mean, it's just an incredible, even dictators in the third world don't win by that much. So he, the head of the Watch and Ward, J. Frank Chase, died. It was so, he died 6 months later, and he was like this powerful force. And his death kind of threw the Watch and Ward into, what would you say, decline. And it was further decline when a Watch and Ward agent bought a copy of Lady Chatterley's Lover from the Dunster House bookstore in Cambridge. That was a couple of years later. And that was like the Cambridge intellectuals' favorite bookstore. And you don't go against Harvard too easily, especially in those days. And it was the future site of Elsie's restaurant, which was beloved by many Harvard students. But anyway, as a result of that, a lot of their most high-profile members quit their board. Many donors just resigned from the society. So stuff like that. But Mencken kind of started the decline of the Watch and Ward in terms of their power and proved that they could be stopped and that they weren't going to win every case. And it was just so publicized that it probably drove Frank Chase to his death. So it's
yeah, and
rather dramatic.
The Dunster House story that all the stories of that bookstore that you go into in the book are kind of almost dramatic. It's like this bookstore is like a character in the story, an iconoclastic character.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating. So I do want to mention a couple of the comments that we're getting in our chat.
Sure.
First of all, I do want I didn't mention this earlier. We do apologize for the camera angle and the space between us. We're still following the protocols the city has put in place for us, and so that's why we're so far away from each other. And we just didn't have a mechanism to have two cameras going at the same time in a way. So hey. So I apologize for that. As far as the questions here, so Bill Martin asks, was Boston different from the rest of the U.S. In regards to censorship? Was banning certain entertainment and writing a thing that was happening elsewhere, or was it unique here?
Well, it was not unique here. I mean, it certainly went on in New York. There were these societies for the suppression of vice in New York and I think Philadelphia and some other city, Chicago. There was actually one in Providence too. They had their own. But Boston was sort of more important because it was sort of viewed as the intellectual center of the United States. The home of the transcendentalists and everything else. And I think the censorship here was much more pronounced than in some of these other cities. And in New York, there were big trials, but I don't think there was anything like this gentleman's agreement kind of secret suppression of so many books as in Boston. It was also a city that had, I think, the most readers of any city in America. I think now it's Seattle, but it was Boston at that time.
We used to be a contender.
Indeed.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. That it's almost like the reason banned in Boston and the Washington Ward are so memorable. It's not that they were doing something special; it's that they were more successful at it.
Yeah. They're extremely successful, and it has that nice ring to it, right? Yeah. Banned in Boston. But somehow Boston, I mean, it was the Athens of America, and it was the intellectual center. So if things were banned here, but it after a while, it became a laughing stock. And there were people in Boston who were appalled by what was going on. And at one point, the owner of Filene's, the great department store, Lincoln Filene, it was after some book was banned, maybe it was Elmer Gantry, I'm not sure, wrote a letter to the Boston Herald just condemning what was going on and saying, it's just making our city into a laughing stock and people aren't going to come here. And some of the newspapers in town began to really oppose what was being done. And things like when Strange Interlude was forced out of town, and that was I believe it was a Pulitzer Prize winning play by Eugene O'Neill. It ran for ages in New York, and things like that just really disturbed people. There's a great story though that I always have to tell it. When Strange Interlude, do we have time to do this?
Plenty. We got plenty of time.
It's quick. When Strange Interlude it's a 5 or 6 hour play.
We don't have that much time.
No. And there was an intermission. So it was, okay, it started it was performed in Quincy, and it starts at like 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And at 9:30, everybody broke for dinner. And then they came back, I guess, for the last act or something. It was quite a marathon. And the place they went to was this restaurant across the street called Howard Johnson's. And it was just a little restaurant in Quincy. And as a result of this, if those of you who don't know Howard Johnson's became sort of ubiquitous across the American landscape. There were Howard Johnson's restaurants everywhere, 28 flavors of ice cream. So it kind of, Boston censorship started this incredible chain of restaurants that later became restaurants and motels, and but they hardly exist. I think there's only one Howard Johnson's left.
Yeah, I remember when the one in Fenway closed just a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
That's great. So we have a question about burlesque, which you can't not talk about burlesque when we're talking about censorship in Boston. Paul Brulé, I believe. Brulette. You know
I
this
know
person.
Him well.
So Paul Brulette, whose name I said completely correctly the first time. He asks, how did burlesque continue to run in Boston well into the 1940s?
Well, yeah. Well, Mayor Curley, for one thing, loved burlesque.
Really?
And yeah, and he would always go. And supposedly JFK and T.S. Eliot also went. And Harvard students love burlesque. No, the Watson Ward really was going after burlesque, not just in Boston, but in Worcester, in other cities. And but there were Watson Ward agents would go in and write what was going on, and keep tabs on things. But the Watson Ward agents were pretty well known to the people who ran burlesque. And there's a really funny story that Anne Corio, who wrote this book called This Was Burlesque, and she was a burlesque queen, and a very famous one. And she claimed that whenever a Watson Ward agent came in, there was a buzzer that went off on stage, and because whoever the ticket taker was recognized the agent, a buzzer went off, and the burlesque semi-nude women would immediately change into costumes, and supposedly that resembled a nun on a walking through on a Sunday stroll or something. I don't know exactly what was going on there. That was her. She was probably exaggerating it, but basically they were on to what was going on. And it wasn't till, well, the old Howard, which was a kind of a center of burlesque in Scully Square, which is
right there.
Yeah,
right
here,
yeah.
Which is where the City Hall is. I think it was in existence almost till 53. And, like Curly shut it down a couple times, but they'd open up. And somehow it just, was kind of the workers' theater or something, and to say nothing of Harvard students. So somehow it got through, but it had some friends in high places as well.
That kind of speaks to what you were talking about earlier about the gentleman's agreement, that if the other participants don't really play ball with the censorship, that it just falls apart.
Yeah, that's what happened. But in New York, for example, burlesque, Mayor LaGuardia just banned it outright, and that was that. So I think somehow burlesque, I don't know, they were clever. They were more clever than the people who owned the bookstores.
So we talked a little bit before this event started about how there have been parallels drawn, rightly or wrongly, between censorship in the 1920s and censorship today, and the concept of quote unquote cancel culture. And do you see any similarities between 1920s Watson Ward and censorship and modern day censorship?
Not too many. I think, first of all, cancel culture today, as it's called, it seems to be a catch-all for a million different things. And it's also being used as a political weapon, obviously. And especially because the Watson Ward did things, kind of behind the scenes. Cancel culture is sort of like, okay, you said something you shouldn't have said when you were 17 years old or something, and you're sort of pilloried in the public for that. So it's kind of different, and you don't have this sort of, secret moral police telling you what to do. But it's ironic that you could argue that the censorship of the 20s was kind of from the right, while this is from the left. But what they might have in common is sort of what are perceived as elites telling people in the 20s what they should read, or today, kind of what they should say or what they should think. There is some censorship. For example, the whole case of the biographer of Philip Roth, which I don't know if you've read about this guy, Blake Bailey, who is a very highly regarded biographer, and he wrote a biography of the author Philip Roth, 900 pages. It was going to be like this huge book of the, where are we, spring, sort of spring going on summer. And, but it was revealed that he had been accused by two women of rape. And immediately the publisher, Norton, pulled the book. And even even though they had printed a huge number of copies. And they not only pulled the book, they pulled another book that Bailey had written, a memoir, some years before that. So clearly another publisher could publish it or something, which is a little different than in the Watch and Ward days. But, this is sort of, canceling a book. So, we could get into a big debate about it, but.
So another really great question was asked in the chat by Charles, and I apologize, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, and I don't want to destroy it on video, but about what the relationship between censorship and Watch and Ward was to prohibition. And I would extrapolate on that just a bit more. What does it have to do, or how is it connected to the progressive era as a whole?
Well, the temperance movement did grow out of the progressive era. It was kind of the same impulses that started the Watch and Ward. Again, it's we know what's good for you. And they sort of acted side by side, I guess. And the Watch and Ward was at its height in the 1920s, which was the era of prohibition. So definitely the impulses were the same, and they both failed.
That's a very.
But it took book censorship a lot longer to fail than prohibition.
It's funny that you connect those two in that way, because it's such a simple answer, but a very powerful one, that they're both these overreaching, perceived as overreaching events by elites or by government, that both just fail entirely,
right?
Because they're trying to control people's morals.
They were all trying to protect the public. It's kind of the same impulse. And like some of the early Watch and Ward activities against gambling and prostitution was very much aimed at protecting women, not just women who were forced to work in houses of ill fame or whatever. But it was because venereal disease, I was just rereading my book and I discovered some of this. Venereal disease was so rampant that the idea that wives would get it from their husbands, who would patronize these prostitutes. Again, that gambling, a lot of young men were attracted to it, and they might be married, and it would impoverish their wives and their children. So it was these impulses of kind of protecting people. You don't know what's good for you, but we do. But there is some, I could sort of understand where, at least in those, in gambling and the social evil, that it made some sense.
Yeah, and you mentioned trying to protect women, and obviously there are major paternalist themes here. But what is the role of women in Watch and Ward and in censorship?
There was none.
Really?
There were no women members of the Watch and Ward until, oddly enough, the 1950s, when a ladies auxiliary of the Watch and Ward was established, which I found very funny. But by that point, they were mostly going after corruption at that, and they even changed their name to get rid of the baggage of Watch and Ward. But there was almost no involvement of women. In fact, the original meeting in 1878 that established the Watch and Ward, women were not allowed inside. And supposedly there were women standing outside saying, "Let us in, why can't we go in?" So many women were members of the Watch and Ward. And actually, there's a woman in Somerville who would have been my neighbor had we overlapped in time, but we didn't, who was an invalid for 40 years. But her father had been quite rich, and she lived in this house. And when she died, she had accumulated $1 million. This was in 1903, I think, 1904. And she left 100,000 to the Watch and Ward, which was a huge amount, and really financed a lot of their activities.
Yeah, and I remember that in the book, and
Yeah,
the thing
so-
that was fascinating. What does the Watch and Ward use that money for, though? Like, what do they actually need to pay for?
Well, they had to pay their agents who would go, you know, raid different, you know, an agent who'd go to a burlesque show and take notes, agents who participated in raids on gambling and prostitution and stuff like that. Yeah, it was an endowment. I don't know what they used it for, but they had to finance their activities. And
Well, and you earlier in the conversation, you mentioned that it's these are essentially an extra legal police force or vigilante force, and by extra legal vigilante force, you really mean like these people work for an organization. That's part of their job is to go out and do investigations. These are volunteers in all cases.
Oh, for sure.
Wow.
Yeah, and yeah, it was, I don't know, you know, some of the people who worked for them had been formerly detectives or
like moral Pinkertons.
Yeah, they weren't necessarily nice people. I mean, the people at the top were, you know, very genteel and very fine citizens of Boston, but some of the people they hired were really sort of, you know, not the most exemplary people. But they had to be paid. So I don't know how much of her money actually, you know, went towards that, but they had quite a large endowment. And again, like Godfrey Cabot, the treasurer, I think over the years, he gave $1 million to the Watch and Ward at different times. So their activities apparently needed to be financed. Wow.
That is wild. You mentioned, so women aren't really allowed to be involved in the organization, the Watch and Ward organization. What does the opposition to Watch and Ward and to censorship look like? Is that organized, and who's involved?
Well, there wasn't much opposition until the late 1920s, but it does involve a lot of Boston intellectuals and well, I mean, they really did. There, a lot of Boston Irish immigrants sort of saw the Watch and Ward as a symbol of Yankee rule, if you will. And so therefore, when the Watch and Ward started to crumble, all these people kind of came out of the woodwork and started attacking them. So there were Boston intellectuals and bohemians. There were some of the kind of daily, more sensationalist press, not the Globe and not the Herald in those days, or the Boston Transcript, you know, published these articles accusing Frank Chase of all kinds of nefarious deeds. And, but most of the, and some in the legal community really objected to the way they entrap people and the way they kind of bullied judges and the police force. So there was opposition, but it was really kept under the surface for a long, long time. But after an American Tragedy was put on trial, there was something called the Ford Hall Frolic, and it was a big event in which Clarence Darrow participated, and all sorts of famous people came. I think Upton Sinclair was there. Lots of people from around the country who were involved in this big protest against censorship in Boston. And there were parodies that went on during it. I mean, it was quite. And Margaret Sanger was there, the famous birth control advocate, and I guess we see her as a eugenicist these days as well. So there were all these prominent intellectuals, but it sort of backfired because there was this feeling that these are outsiders who are telling us how we should behave in our city.
That's actually really interesting, given in light of the world we currently live in and the perception of like Hollywood elites telling you what to do.
Right. So here was another elite. I mean, it's crazy. You had the elites who were behind censorship. Then there's another kind of elite that comes in and says, "Oh no, this is bad." So,
So when we're running out of time, and I could keep going all day because I have so many questions, but I do just want to get a kind of bow on this story before encouraging everyone who hasn't read or finished the book to just run out and get it, because I can't emphasize enough how enjoyable a read this is for a history book, and just in general, there's such powerful figures and characters in it who just continue to pop up. Mencken is the one that sticks out to me the most, but there's plenty of them. Watch and Ward starts in the late 19th century. You mentioned it's still kind of around in the 50s, but it's not really around anymore, right? So
No.
what does the decline look like?
Well, the decline looks like in the 1920s, they sort of lose their power. The gentleman's agreement falls apart. The police start doing all this really pretty bad censorship, even worse than some of what the Watch and Ward did. But it would pop up here and there. And even in the early 1950s, it really worked against, there was I guess a state referendum on the lottery, and it worked against it. There was some corruption scheme that wound up on 60 Minutes or CBS. I guess it was CBS, called Biography of a Bookie Joint, in which Watch and Ward agents, this is I think 1962. So they changed their name to the Citizens Crime Commission. And then eventually it became an organization. It just started really fading then. It wasn't doing any censorship stuff. It kind of came back into the censorship game in the 1940s with a book called Forever Amber, which was a huge national bestseller, and they got it banned in Boston. And but the decline was, they sort of evolved into almost a organization that's really concerned with recidivism and people coming out of jail, and some good stuff. It sort of returned in a way to its more reformist notions, but none of the old people were around at that point. Godfrey Cabot lived to 101, but he died in 1962, and it just kind of faded away, and most people don't even know about it. And when I did write the book, Banned in Boston, the impulse for it really had to do with Beacon Press, my publishers. An editor there discovered that their offices were the Watch and Ward's old offices. And he didn't really know what the Watch and Ward was, but he looked it up and he thought, oh, this is fascinating. Who are these people? And because I think they're largely forgotten, and it is part of the sort of hidden history of Boston. And
it's fascinating that Beacon Press, too, of all people, ends up in all organizations, ends up in those offices, because Beacon Press not known for books that you'd probably think the Watch and Ward would like.
Right, that's true. And eventually they moved out of that office on Mount Vernon Street. So it did fade away, but censorship doesn't fade away. It somehow comes back in different forms, and a lot of court decisions by the Supreme Court just made it. Did we lose our audience?
No, we still got them. We're good. My screen just changed, but they appear to be still there. So,
okay. It made censorship very difficult to happen. But Boston had a city censor right up into the 60s who, when Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf opened here, tried to get words removed from it, and which he did, I think.
Well, thank you. And this was really just a really enlightening and interesting conversation. So great to talk about a period in Boston outside of our kind of traditional 18th century lens, because there's so much more to the story in this city, and you've really done a great job.
Oh, thanks, Matt. I appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun.
So Neil Miller, and the book is Banned in Boston. I can't emphasize enough that you should go pick it up if you haven't already, and I'll turn it back over to Matt and Lo.
Great, thanks, Matt. And Neil, thank you so much again for
my pleasure,
taking
Matt.
your time and participating and spending this time with all of our members. I really hope you've all enjoyed your time with Neil, and I do want to thank you again for being here, and of course for being members. And this is, like I said earlier, this is not something that we can do alone. So thank you definitely for making events like these possible. I do want to flag a couple more things in the next week. So next week, exactly 1 week from tonight, we are hosting Visual History, Interpreting the Past Through Comics, which is a panel exploring how creators have used comics and graphic novels to tell some of America's most difficult histories. So that's next Thursday, May 11th at 6:30. Later this month, in celebration of National Preservation Month, we're hosting Beyond Boston, Old South Meeting House's Global Construction on Saturday, May 29th at 2 o'clock. So the panelists from that will actually be experts in 18th century architecture with specialities in ranging from forgotten New England histories, Georgian English architecture, and transatlantic building materials. So that'll be a great, interesting conversation. And I do want to also just flag for you that we are looking forward to really opening our sites soon. Hopefully by early to midsummer, we'll be open again, and we'll be able to welcome all of our members who, as an added benefit of your membership, do get free admission to both of our sites. So we do look forward to welcoming you to our sites sometime this summer. Do keep an eye on your very special members newsletter, your Members View newsletter that you receive. Information about reopening will be in there as well. So thank you all so much again, and until next time, stay well.